and the broader network. So thank you so much for doing that. For those of you that I haven't met before and that haven't met me, I'm Justina Linke. I am with UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub, and I'm leading Urban Imaginaries on the part of UNDP in partnership with CPI, who you will meet today. Some of you already know, part of the team. As you know, this session is the first session in a series. We will have 4 inspiration sessions, including this one. And so we're very happy to see so many of you show up for this session, but we also encourage you to keep inviting your partners, other municipalities into next sessions coming in. This is all, as you know, part of a broader initiative, which is called Mayors for Economic Growth. And this is an initiative that we are implementing in partnership with the European Union. So a bit of a focus that we have is in particular on the Eastern Partnership countries. But as you will see, this inspiration session and next inspiration sessions are basically, as we hope, of use and of interest to also many others. So without further ado, I will hand over to Beatriz from the Center for Public Impact to open the session, to introduce our speaker for today, and to guide us through the session itself. Thank you so much for showing up in such wonderful numbers. I'm really hoping that the session would inspire you, as the name indicates and aspires to. So thank you so much, and handing over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Justina, and good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first inspiration session of the Urban Imaginaries program. My name is Beatrice, and I am the program manager of the Urban Imaginaries program on behalf of CPI side. So working closely with Justina and the rest of the team on this. Just before we kick off, I'd like to share some small guidelines to make sure that we can all follow the session correctly. So please check your audio and microphone and ensure you are on mute during the session while speakers are speaking. Interpretation is available in Azeri, Armenian, Georgian, Romanian, and Ukrainian. So if you would like to listen to any of those channels, please select the channel you would like to listen the session into. And last but not least, kindly rename yourself, indicating your name, but also your city, so we know who you are and where you are based if you decide to intervene during the session. So before I hand over to my colleague Thea, who will be the speaker today, allow me to take a brief moment to introduce the program and share some words about our organization, the Center for Public Impact. So the Urban Imaginaries program was launched earlier this year as a joint effort between UNDP and CPI. It is designed as a learning journey to support city teams to reimagine the future of their city and help them to design place-based solutions to their most pressing urban challenges by adapting complexity-informed approaches, such as experimenting and so forth, and harnessing together the power of collective learning. So just briefly, who are we? Our organization is called the Center for Public Impact. It is a global not-for-profit organization that serves as a learning partner for governments, public servants, and the diverse network of change makers who are leading the change to reimagine government. So we work with governments and partners across the globe to hold space to collectively make sense of the complex challenges we face and drive meaningful change through learning and experimentation. So today's session will actually be delivered by our colleague Thea Snow, who has been leading CPI's work on storytelling for systems change, and who I am very happy to introduce today. Thea leads CPI's work in Australia and New Zealand, and her experience spans the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. She has worked as a lawyer, a public servant for almost a decade, and as part of Nesta's government innovation team, the UK Innovation Agency for Social Good. Thea recently returned to Melbourne after spending a few years in London, where in addition to working at Nesta, she completed a Master in Public Administration at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So without further ado, yes?
I apologize. It seems that the Ukrainian translation doesn't work.
No problem at all. We can wait for this to be fixed, and then I will hand over to Thea in any case.
I get, now I can hear Ukrainian one, so I will ask colleagues to check in. So as for me, it sounds good. Ukrainian interpretation is back, so we can kick it off.
Super, that's great. So right on time then, I'm happy interpretation is not working. So without further ado, Thea, I'm gonna hand over to you to lead us through the rest of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bea, and thank you so much for having me today. It's really such a privilege to be part of this conversation from very far away on the other side of the earth, where it is currently very cold. I know that a lot of you are experiencing intense heat. So I also want to acknowledge, as we do in Australia, the traditional custodians of the lands from which I joined today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm just going to share my screen and then get started. Give me one moment. There we go. Okay. You'd think I'd have this down pat now, but it still takes a few goes. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about this idea of storytelling for systems change. I'm going to be starting by talking a little bit about the idea or the question of what is storytelling. We're then going to talk about systems change and what we mean when we talk about systems change and what's the relationship between storytelling and systems change. Then going to spend a bit of time talking about how do we create better stories, and then leave some time at the end for a group conversation and Q&A. So what is storytelling? Well, I thought I'd actually start this presentation by telling you the story of how this work came about. Because what happened was the Centre for Public Impact in Australia and New Zealand hosted an event actually about systems change, where we got a number of systems change experts to come together to talk about what is systems change and what does it mean for government to think in systems. And a woman called Taya Dusseldorp came along to that session, and she reached out to me afterwards. Now, Taya Dusseldorp runs a philanthropic organisation here in Australia called the Dusseldorp Forum, which works with communities, often disadvantaged communities in different parts of Australia, to really empower communities to drive the kinds of change that they want and need for themselves. And Taya said to me, you know, I feel like I'm seeing such great work happening in the communities that we work with, but they're struggling to tell the stories of their change. And so people don't understand the impact of their change. Is there a possibility that we could work together to explore how to equip these communities to tell better stories of their work, better stories of change? And so Centre for Public Impact partnered with Dusseldorp Forum and Hands Up Mallee, which is a collective impact backbone team here in Australia, to explore this question of what does it mean to tell stories about community-led systems change work. And to do this, we spoke to community members, we spoke with storytellers, we spoke with people in government to understand from them what do good stories look like for you, and what makes storytelling hard. And really what I'm going to be presenting to you today is the insights that were generated through those conversations and through the report that we wrote off the back of those conversations. So to begin with, what is storytelling? I love this quote by Kazuo Ishiguro because I think that stories are about feelings. And that's what we really heard in our conversations. Stories make you feel connected to things in a way that other forms of communication often don't and can't. Stories connect with people at the level of heart and emotion, rather than at the level of the head. And that's why stories are so powerful. And I think, you know, we can overcomplicate what storytelling is, because at the end of the day, you know, I have 3 young children. They all know what stories are. Stories feature in their lives from the moment they're born. We read them stories, we tell them stories, they tell us stories. Stories are such an innately human thing. And so before I continue, I actually wanted to pause and ask you to share your ideas in a word cloud. Baya's going to put up a link in the chat, and we're going to ask you in your language to write, what does storytelling mean to you? So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Baya's put a link in the chat, and we want to see in one word, what does storytelling mean to you? Are people having difficulty with the word cloud?
Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. I'm Nunu. I represent Batumi municipality in this case, and I'm very curious about this meeting. So, in my opinion, the storytelling is experience exchanges and share experience, and also your opinions and emotions also.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Elsevar, did you want to share as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. That is really very interesting training or workshop. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah, I think storytelling is about the voices, or is about the opinion of the people, of the residents of the community that we have in our cities. It is about how do they think, what are the main problems, and what are their suggestions or proposals to solve this problem. So basically, these are the approach of solving or addressing problems with the voices or with the opinion of the local people, of the communities.
Thank you. And you can see here on the slide that Baya has captured some of the ideas that people have shared in the word cloud about what storytelling is. So it's about perspectives, creativity. Some of these words I can't read, unfortunately, but they look beautiful. Connections, empathy or empatica. So I think what we're seeing is that stories are often about sort of connection, you know, and different perspectives, and that very much resonates with what we heard. So I'll keep talking through what we heard through our work. So we wanted to understand what makes a good story, because, you know, some stories are better than others. And what we heard from people is that good stories have to be authentic, and they have to honor the voice of the story holder, the person whose story is being told. And a lot of people who we spoke to highlighted just how important it is that stories are told using the language and the voice of community rather than of professionals. It was a really interesting insight shared by someone who contrasted stories, like the words and feelings, to data, which is often, you know, hard numbers. And she said, data takes away people's ownership of their story, and storytelling gives that power back to them. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about how power shifts when you use story as a way of talking about change rather than numbers and quantitative data. We heard that it should be the story holders who decide which stories to be told and how to tell them. And our conversations also revealed that good stories resist bending themselves to the existing narrative. They're happy to challenge the dominant narrative. And it's actually through telling different stories that narratives begin to change. And I'll come back more to that as well a bit later. But it was also acknowledged that while centering community voice and perspective is key, this can be a really difficult thing to do. And it's not what we're used to doing either. So it's important to acknowledge that this idea of honouring the voice whose person is being told and giving them agency to tell their own story is quite countercultural in a lot of contexts. We also heard that good stories are written simply and are easy to understand. They've got a clear structure and message. Good stories are persuasive and engaging. You hang on every word. They're emotional, like I touched on before. They capture you at the level of heart, not just mind. They provide more context and insight than numbers can. So I often say quantitative data is really important and really good at describing the what of a situation. But stories help you delve into the why. And good stories, we heard, are honest, inclusive, and gentle. We also heard that not all stories are good stories. And it was really interesting to say to people, well, what does it look like when stories aren't good? And what we heard was that stories aren't good when they're judgmental, when they pass judgment on a person's situation, when they're centered in ego or designed to promote something. They're designed to promote a person's particular agenda. And stories are not good when they're driven by the motives of the storyteller rather than the needs and priorities of the community or the story holder themselves. It was also interesting to hear, and I'll come to systems change again, what we mean by systems change in just a moment, but that stories about systems change need to sort of resist a traditional structure, which has a clear beginning and middle and end. And the importance of being able to keep building on a story and allowing a story to evolve as the situation evolves. And again, that's not necessarily a structure or process that we're particularly used to. Another thing that we wanted to understand is what can stories look like? Often when we think about stories, we think about books or written word, or maybe you think about telling stories to each other around the campfire or, verbal stories. But what we heard through this work as well was that stories can be so many different things. Stories can be songs, and Indigenous Australian people told a lot of their stories through song and art. Stories can be food. It was really interesting to hear people talking about how, particularly in some refugee communities, the food and the exchange of food and the sharing of food is a way to tell stories about your life and your heritage and your history. And the other thing that we heard was that people were really inspired about the idea of stories as a collective endeavor. So not just stories about individuals, not just my story, but our story. How do we as a city or town or community, whatever it might be, come together to collectively shape a story about what our collective identity is and where we've come from and where we want to go together? So that's what storytelling is. I've covered, what do we mean by storytelling? What do good stories look like? What do not such good stories look like? And what do different forms of story look like? But the framing of our report and the framing of the research that we did was about systems, storytelling for systems change. So what do we mean by that? And what is the relationship between those two things? Systems change can be a bit of a trendy word that people use without thinking too much what it means. But we quite like this definition by Common Ground, which is a group here in Australia. And they say, when we talk about systems of society, we're talking about the processes and institutions and structure that shape the way that we live. Things like governments and education and media, as well as dominant societal norms and behaviours. So the systems, the processes and institutions and structures are shaped by narratives and mindsets that people hold. And shifting the system means shifting the conditions that hold those systems in place and thinking about all the layers of the system. So not just when you're trying to drive change, not just trying to change how things are done, but also the fundamental beliefs and mindsets that sit below that, and which often in invisible ways influence the way that things are done. So what is the relationship between storytelling and systems change? What we found was really interesting, which is that stories can be used, yes, to shine a light on the change that is happening in communities, but stories themselves can actually be a tool to change the system itself. That's because stories encourage new perspectives, because stories challenge traditional power dynamics, and because stories can offer a form of healing. But before I move forward, I'm just going to take a step back again and give you an example around what a systems change initiative might look like. In Marinuka, Burke, which again is in Australia, there's an Aboriginal community which is working differently in new ways with service providers and governments to realign how it creates good lives for the residents of Burke. What they are doing is interrogating how decisions are made, how data is shared, and really challenging norms around traditional power dynamics. And it's through those challenging, that challenging of norms around power, around who makes decisions, that the entire system is being challenged. And that's what we mean when we talk about systems change initiatives. So I think that to go back to this point, one of the really important things about systems change work is that numbers can't tell the full story. And that's why people often look to storytelling as a tool to really dig into the rich and deep layers of change that happen when you're talking about this kind of grassroots, community-led systems change efforts like that we see in Marinuka Burke. As I said, stories are a force for change in their own right. Stories, I love this quote, they encourage new perspectives, but they also build empathy. Someone said, stories are empathy machines. Stories shift mindsets, and as I said, they can heal. There was another beautiful quote by a woman who said, if people are transformed through the process of sharing stories, systems are transformed. Stories can help people build new connections and relationships and conversations. Through stories, you can teach and learn. And another beautiful quote was, you can't unlearn someone else's perspective once you've experienced it through a story. So stories help people see new possibilities and understand and see the world in different ways. And I thought I'd just give a quick example. So in Marinuka Burke, which is that systems change initiative that I spoke about earlier, there's quite a lot of teenage pregnancy. And if you think about the way that stories are often told about teenage pregnancy, they use a very deficit mindset. So they're stories of opportunities lost, or situations that have unfolded in ways that were beyond the control of those young women. But if you start to shift that language and tell different stories. Tell stories of hope, of success, of triumph in challenging situations, and you use language, positive language rather than deficit language, then the stories that those women, those young women start to tell about themselves change, and the beliefs that they hold about themselves change, and the narrative around what it means to be a young person who is pregnant changes, and the whole sense of possibility becomes opened up again if you use language of possibility rather than language which is around despair and the loss of opportunity and hope. By telling different stories, we change how these young women see themselves and what they believe is possible for their lives. But it's not necessarily easy to tell stories about systems change, and there are a number of reasons why that's the case. We asked people to consider, what makes it hard to tell these kinds of stories, and we heard a number of things. Firstly, that power imbalances and a lack of trust can make it hard for people to share their stories, because often sharing stories requires a real rawness and vulnerability, which can only happen if people feel safe. But oftentimes not enough is invested into making people feel safe in order to allow them to lean into that vulnerability. Another key barrier to effective storytelling was just not having enough time or resource or skill to do it well. It is time and resource intensive to capture and share stories. And as someone shared, stories often get lost in the doing of the work. People are so busy doing the work that they're like, we don't have time to tell the stories. And I can really connect with that. Dalit Kaplan, who was another woman who we interviewed, introduced this lovely concept of story literacy. She said we need to invest in people's story literacy, which involves helping them understand how to craft and tell great stories. Another reason it can be hard to tell stories about systems change is because systems change, as I've said, is messy work. It involves so many people working together in different ways. It involves stepping forward and then stepping backwards and then stepping sideways. And we're used to stories where there's a problem, an action, and a solution. And stories about systems change don't fit that mold. So it makes stories more difficult to craft for people who do like that sort of linear and predictable flow of a story. There's also a challenge around the readiness to receive stories. So in order for stories to have an impact, stories need to be heard. We often focus a lot on how do we craft good stories. But as Fiona Merlin, who was another person we spoke to, said, there's a difference between listening to a story and actually hearing it. And we need an audience who listen to understand. But that's easier said than done, because sometimes government and philanthropists and other people just aren't prepared or able to receive the message through stories. And they don't necessarily believe that stories hold the same rigor or validity as quantitative data. So that's another challenge too. And finally, bias, because we all know that storytelling is not a neutral exercise. The way that questions are framed, the way that answers are interpreted, what's left out, what's included, all act to shape the stories that emerge. And it's very hard. It's actually impossible to take a totally neutral stance on that. The factors that make storytelling difficult are technical and structural and institutional, as you would have just seen. The technical barriers are easier to address than some of the structural and institutional ones, such as power imbalances and bias. But I thought I'd stop talking about sort of what we heard now and give a couple of examples of how people are using stories to drive change. The first example is from Oxford Hub and Arts at the Old Fire Station. So when COVID-19 hit, Oxford Hub knew that they had to do something. So they quickly banded together and created Oxford Together, which was a community response to the pandemic. Oxford Hub immediately, as soon as it set up Oxford Together, teamed up with Arts at the Old Fire Station to ask them to start collecting stories from all people involved in Oxford Together in different capacities, volunteers, city council members, people receiving the support of Oxford Together, to understand what was the experience like for them and what were they learning. They recognised the importance of capturing in real time the learning that was happening, not only to ensure that their response was appropriate, but also so that improved, so that the lessons learned could be carried into the future. And they used a technique called the most significant change technique. That was actually developed by an Australian woman called Jessica Dart. And what that does is really interesting, because instead of at the beginning of a program predefining what the success metrics are, what the most significant change technique does is it says to people who are experiencing a program or an offering, what is the most significant change that you experienced as a result of your involvement with Oxford Together? And then people tell their stories, and then a sense-making process notices patterns in those stories and draws together key insights. So it's almost like it's an evaluation method which values the perspective of the story holder as being the right person to define what change looks like for them. And only stories can help them do that. Another really interesting example of stories being used is in Burnie Works, again here in Australia. And what they're doing in Burnie is they're actually training community members to be community knowledge collectors. So the idea is that Burnie Works is a collective impact initiative, which is again a community-led systems change initiative working to improve the lives of people in Burnie. And what they're doing is they're training local knowledge collectors to be equipped and mentored in how to capture the learning and the insights that are emerging from that project. And the lead for that project says, I really see this project as critical for allowing upskilling of community to tell their story in their words, on their terms, in order to make change for not only themselves, but also for many others. So a really interesting concept of, which is disrupting that idea that external evaluators sort of come in and harvest stories and then tell them on behalf of the community, and instead training community members in effective storytelling methods and processes so that they are empowered to tell their own stories. So what is needed to create and share stories of systems change? We wanted to understand, and this is my last point before we move to a Q&A, we wanted to understand, and we asked the people who we were speaking to, what would you need? Because that was Taya's original question. What do people need to be able to better and more effectively create and share their stories of change? And we heard a few things. People felt that there needed to be a greater appreciation and understanding of storytelling traditions across different cultures and demographic. There was also recognised that, people need to value storytelling more. And how do we start, again, building the readiness of people to value and recognise the importance of stories as a valid way of understanding and shifting and driving change in a system. One of the key challenges that people highlighted was the need to challenge our pretty deep bias towards quantitative data and the scientific method, and instead explore how can we weave together. It's not saying we don't need quantitative metrics, of course we do, but how do we weave and blend what some people call thick data with big data? And finally, we also heard that telling stories can be hard work. And so what people told us they would really appreciate is community as a practice and mentors for community storytellers to really support them in this work, which, as I say, on the one hand, storytelling is such a natural human thing. On the other hand, crafting great stories and stories about systems change in particular can be challenging. And people said what we'd love is other people to share ideas with and bounce ideas off. So that is, oh, one more slide actually. We need to understand the supply and the demand side of storytelling. So that's the idea that yes, we need to know how to craft better stories, but we also need to work on understanding what do we need to do to build the readiness in our partners, in philanthropists, in funders, in government, to receive stories and to take those stories seriously as a valid form of evidence and information, and a valid way of understanding the change that is happening and the challenges that exist in any given place. So this is our report, Storytelling for Systems Change. Feel free to jump in and have a look yourselves, but I feel like I've spoken a lot. So I'd like to pause there and invite group conversation and questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see all your faces again. And I'd just love to open up to questions. Mustafa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tia, for excellent presentation, and greetings from Kiev to everyone, to all participants. I have no question, but rather a comment maybe. And if you allow me, I will continue in Ukrainian to make it more clear for my partners and colleagues from Ukraine. Я хотів би наголосити на важливості.
I would like to stress the importance of the skill of storytelling. It's about telling a story about the life of your community and changes that are planned in this community and the changes that are happening. It is so important to Ukrainian communities, especially at this moment in time. There are two things to this. Firstly, the internal mobilization. Storytelling reflects the capacities and skills of local leaders, mayors, municipality people, which try to implement changes. So storytelling is a way of doing internal mobilization. Many of the communities nowadays are risking to lose some of their population. Some people no longer believe in what they can do. So it is important to offer support to communities at this moment, to mobilize them, so that people, community members, and local residents could have an incentive, and they would have enough stamina and energy to keep moving on. So that's the internal mobilization of communities, and that is so important. It's not just the responsibility of the government. It's the responsibility of everybody at the community level, everybody involved in community development. And the second point is about mobilization of partners and external resources. So as you tell the story of your community, you communicate the plans and future perspectives, and that's how you can mobilize resources and partners. We can see a lot of communities are on it. They are telling stories about their challenges, also about their plans and needs, and they're open to partnerships. They welcome other players, and many of them have been successful in mobilizing their resources in order to go back to normal in this war setting. So once again, I'd like to thank to the presenter for this beautiful presentation.
Okay, thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I should say, I really welcome others to share their thoughts as well. So I welcome questions or reflections and observations around how you may have used storytelling in your work or your life personally as well. Irakli, thank you.
It is this topic is really interesting. You know, in general, in our life, no, in private life, not just in professional, it's very important to hear the story, to prepare the story, and to prepare others to receive this story properly. So I mean, the storytelling and this conveying this information. For example, if we give a child 2 apples and then if we add 3 apples, we're telling child that 2 and 3 makes 5. Yeah, so we need to show. So we should use the same approach in this situation as well. We should be as simple as possible, like we're telling a child, because we should help others to perceive everything properly. We also should be aware in advance who is our audience and whom we are telling this story.
Thank you. That's a wonderful observation. And I think definitely echoes what we heard, which is that we have a tendency to overcomplicate stories, to use academic language, and actually keeping things simple helps people connect to the stories much more easily. So I think that's a great point. Zemfira.
Are you listening?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Oh, we seem to have just lost you, Zemfira. Try. There we go.
Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone. I am Zemfira from Areni community of Armenia. My observation on the topic is the following. Stories can be different, and you have to select the right approach to telling it, the topic and the subject, in order to succeed. One vivid example is all of us being present here. If I presented the story of my community wrongly, in not correct way, I would never be here with presenting my community. You have to present your story in the right way, in the right place, and in the context of today's meeting. Storytelling is about consolidation and mobilization, and stories should be created in due time, in due manner, and for proper audience. In other words, every story should be in its right place, whether be it on the community development or any other subject. Thank you very much for your presentation. We learned so much and do appreciate it. It's really clear. This much basically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zemfira. And absolutely agree with what you're saying. One of the points that I didn't raise, and Irina, I will come to in a second, but was that someone made the point that different stories are appropriate for different kinds of contexts. So the type of story that you tell if you're trying to advocate for change might look different to the kind of story that you're trying to tell if you're trying to build connections and relationships. So absolutely agree that being mindful of what type of story you need to tell in order to achieve your purpose is something that we need to be thinking about. So Irina, over to you.
Всім доброго дня. Чутно мене?
Hello, can you all hear me? Okay. Hello to all partners and participants in this event. I'd like to say that it is important to do the storytelling in Ukraine. The Melitopol City Hall went to Zaporozhye. The Melitopol city is occupied, and it is so important to us to keep telling stories, to keep communicating things. We need to be heard by our residents. So thank you for getting this process started. To us, storytelling really matters to the locals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. We probably have time for one or two more questions or comments. I'm interested to know, have people experimented with storytelling in different ways in your work already? And how has that worked, and what challenges have you encountered?
Alô, bună ziua. În primărie. Puteți să-mi slați dispoziție. Chiar primarul nu a fost...
I think someone accidentally, someone connected accidentally the microphone.
ისმის ხმა.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Sorry? Do you hear?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
So, in general, regarding storytelling, I just want to provide my observation. Storytelling is very important. You know, it doesn't. Any story needs to be told properly. We need to take into consideration audience whom we are telling. For example, I with pleasure tell stories about my municipality, and and we also understand that story could be told in negative context, but you need to take into consideration whom you are telling the story. You know, we use this method in our work, even within the frameworks of this project. We participants share stories with one another about our municipality. So we do this on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. And great to hear that you're already experimenting with, with using storytelling as part of your work, and hearing from people about the importance of storytelling too. Any more comments or observations? We've got time for one more question.
So if I may just jump in with one comment. As you know, some of colleagues joining this session are already taking active part in different programs under Mayors for Economic Growth. Some are working on their portfolios, just like Zemfira, who also shared her comment. Some are working on their learning process and testing under Urban Imaginaries. For both of these, I would strongly encourage all of you colleagues to also keep thinking and referring back to what Pia has been sharing with us, and we are more than happy to continue working with you on specific stories and how to craft them, how to deliver them, where to deliver them, and so on and so forth. So we just wanted to use that to bring that back and say, let's create the stories together and let's see how to make them as impactful and as relevant as possible.
Wonderful. Thanks, Justina. And just before I hand over to Bea to close the session, I do just want to say as well that I think, you know, one of the things that I was struck by was the idea that we tend to limit ourselves in what we think stories are, you know, that stories are written word, or stories are books, or stories are stories that we tell each other. And it was so beautiful and powerful to hear people talking about stories as being so many different kinds of things. And so I'd really encourage you, as you explore what storytelling can mean in your context and your work, to think really broadly about how to tell stories in different ways. Because essentially, you know, at where we started was that storytelling is about looking back at some of the words that you used: empathy, building perspectives, you know, connection. And sometimes words are not the best way to build empathy and connection. Sometimes experiences are. So thinking about stories really holistically, I think, was something that I certainly took away from the conversations and that project. But I'll hand to you now, Bea, to close.
Thank you so much, Thea, for such a great presentation, really. Dear colleagues, I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did personally. And I did want to say just briefly that the PowerPoint presentation, the report, Storytelling for System Change, that Thea mentioned, as well as a 2-page summary, will be available on the UNDP website. And I'm going to ask my colleague Akshay to share that link in the chat as I speak. And then last but not least, don't hesitate to contact us if you have any additional questions at all. And again, you will have the email addresses in the chat in a second. For the 9 cities of the Urban Imaginaries program, cohort 1, we do have a practical session now with Thea. So I will invite you to join us, please, in the other link that was shared with you. And that was it from me, really. So thanks, everybody, again for joining us. And I wish you a very nice end of the day, wherever you are on the globe. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Have a nice day.